All right, thank you, Stan Grant, for taking the time to speak with me. Firstly, I'm just going to jump straight in and ask, what will a treaty achieve for Indigenous rights in Australia?
Well, look, there's several things. First of all, when you come to a treaty, there are a lot of questions you need to ask. How and where and with whom are they negotiated? Are they state-based treaties? Are they federal treaties? Is there a federal body that then devolves power to local groups? How do you represent the multiplicity of interests and nations in Australia? So we need to define terms before we even get down to negotiation. Treaty itself, as we've seen around the world, enshrines the way people interact with government. It enshrines a set of laws and practices for a society to be able to function. For Indigenous people, it is creating mechanisms by which we can function in a society that has not always been seen to work for our benefit. In fact, has done the opposite, has left us marginalised and outside the process, and we see that in the terrible statistics that dog Indigenous people still today. So treaty is a mechanism of dealing with the past, being able to acknowledge our history, to acknowledge the rights inherent in Indigenous people, and I think given the sovereignty of the state, to enshrine those things in a broad Western liberal democratic model that can accommodate the group rights of First Peoples with the overarching rights and sovereignty of the state. That's the sort of challenge that we face. Where that is done successfully, and studies have shown this in New Zealand, North America and Canada, countries that are not without their problems, but where it is done successfully and it leads to good capacity building and strong governance, strong self-determination, you can have positive outcomes, and that's what we're really looking for.
Thank you. So talking about the treaties and the power they have and what the rights they provide for Indigenous people, is there a tension between the idea of a treaty being, I guess, a Western mechanism of law and the power that Western law has, and I guess Indigenous rights, in that basically it's people living on a land that that has always been their own, and I guess having to buy into, for want of a better way of putting it, into a Western convention.
That's the bind of colonised peoples. To be able to activate rights and define rights entails inherently some acquiescence to the sovereignty of the coloniser. It's not a perfect world, it's not a perfect system. But this has been the reality of peoples around the world, and it need not be something that stops us being able to make these arrangements and these agreements. Australia is a peculiar and particular case because other countries, of course, have sovereignty at contact, have treaty at contact. New Zealand, North America and Canada. We don't. Terra nullius extinguished our rights. We are now trying to forge something into a system that has been designed not with us in mind, in fact has been designed, as we've seen with successive laws, to exclude us from the broader nation. So it is particularly fraught in Australia, but it need not mean that we fail. We should still be able to find an accommodation of group rights more broadly in a Western liberal democratic model that then gives the individuals within those societies the capacity to live their lives and make their choices as free determining individuals. You can't do that for Indigenous people when the weight of our history sits so heavily on us and those fundamental rights have been denied and have never been properly enshrined in the concept of Western liberal democracy in Australia. And that's our challenge.
And your voice has become one that cannot be ignored. And what is it about your approach, do you think, that makes people listen and pay attention to these issues?
I don't know. I mean, it can be ignored. If people want to just ignore what I say, they're welcome to it. It doesn't mean that people agree. It doesn't even mean that all Indigenous people agree. I'm sure there are some Indigenous people who take a much harder line than I do. I think mine is a conciliatory diplomatic voice. That's my nature. My view of the world is informed by my experience of the world, and having lived in a world and the world of war and conflict does alter your world view. I mean, you cannot stand in the middle of a suicide bombing and see bodies blown to pieces, see people picking the remains of human beings out of the shrapnel-marked holes in a wall and putting them in plastic bags to bury them, to see heads severed from bodies. You cannot see that and not have that impact on you. And I think I bring that to the way that I try to see our country and our place in this country. A country, first of all, where we can peacefully disagree, peacefully resolve our differences. A country that is blessed in so many ways with a stable foundation of democracy, but has failed to acknowledge the rights of the First Peoples. Those things to me don't make sense. You can't be the type of nation that Australia proclaims to be and is seen to be, and still not find room to accommodate the rights of the First Peoples successfully and in peace. We can do that here, and so I suppose I try to speak to the diplomacy of that, to look at ways in which we can marry the rights of Indigenous peoples into a broad Western liberal democratic system. A system that, for its faults, has been seen or can be seen to provide stability for the greatest number in those societies. And certainly given the societies that I've seen, which have been fractured, ruled by despots, fraught with war and conflict, a country like Australia looks like a haven of peace for so many. So why can't we get it right around this? And that's my message, and I suppose if people hear that message, they may feel that that speaks to them and they may see themselves in that sort of society. But as I say, there are those who would ignore, there are those who would question and criticise, there are those among my own who would take a much harder line, and there are those on the non-Indigenous side who would see even what I'm saying as being a stretch too far, as something that challenges the fabric of the nation as a whole. But this is a debate we need to have.
Stan Grant, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, pleasure.